I would like to welcome you to Lead Montessori Community Conversations. My name is Mirka. We are broadcasting this session from Montessori Institute Prague and from Lead Montessori. I have my colleague Sveta with me, who is being our wonderful tech host. And
Just keep an eye on the classroom in case there's a...
I will ask you to please stay muted throughout the session. Thank you. Great. Okay. All right. Let's see. So the title of our community conversation today is Words That Matter, How We Can Help Children Become Resilient Learners. And before I give word to a colleague of mine from Amsterdam, from Association Montessori International, to introduce our speaker, I would like to, for those of you who are new, mention why we do these community conversations and what is a Lead Montessori initiative, just quickly. So we get together every Thursday at the same time at 4 o'clock Central European time. We have been having these meetings ever since March, and as you can see, they are widely attended. Today we have had over 230 registrants, and close to 100 people is in the session already. And this meeting is free of charge. It's a community meeting. It's a meeting for Montessori practitioners, leaders, lead teachers, just colleagues, or even parents, people who want to get together and around a Montessori topic for us to meet, to be together, to hear an important message and to possibly discuss it, reflect on it, and to use this time together as time for connection and for mutual support. So welcome to the session. We're very happy you are with us. And I think we can go ahead and start. Just a little bit about Zoom or online session protocol. I did say it already, please stay muted throughout the session. This time today, we would like you to stay on, to keep your camera on, because we are going to have an interactive breakout room time, which means we'll be able to go into smaller groups and discuss. So we want to see you, we want to connect with you through seeing you on camera. So please stay with your cameras on today. And we are going to record this session. We'll start recording in just a moment. We are going to broadcast it live on Facebook for people who aren't able to join us here on Zoom. And we will be recording and broadcasting only the first part, only the talk given by Eddie. And then when it's time to go into discussion and into the connecting part and sharing part, we will turn the streaming and the recording off. Therefore, we'll have safe space. You can ask any questions you have. You can share anything you like. What is shared here stays here in this session, and it doesn't go anywhere outside of this safe space. I think I said the most important things, Sveta, right? I didn't forget anything. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so now I will invite my colleague Joke from AMI, from Association Montessori International in Amsterdam, to please unmute herself and introduce our speaker. We always ask if it's possible, when it's possible, to introduce our speaker by someone who actually knows him. And Joke has worked with Eddie before, so we invited Joke from AMI to please introduce Eddie. So Joke, please go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So do I say Dobry den or do I say ahoy?
You can say both, and it's wonderful. Hello and ahoy, a dobrý den.
Okay. Well, and hello, of course, to this, exciting Montessori event. And I'm delighted that I can introduce Dutch psychologist Eddie Brummelman. And I will also greet Eddie, specifically in Dutch. Dag Eddie, en alvast veel succes voor straks. Now, I'd like to tell you a bit about how AMI discovered Eddie. For our general meetings that we always have in April, we always are on the lookout for special keynote speakers that can bring that little extra, who can offer substance and knowledge and insights. And a few years ago, we were brainstorming, and then Stephen Hughes, a neuroscientist, who was then the chair of AMI's research committee, sort of said, wow, I've come across this work by Eddie Brimmelman, and I think AMI would be really interested, and, I suggest you can, you team up with them, you connect with them. And that's what we did. I mean, and see where it got us and where it got Eddie, of course. Now, Eddie is a specialist in researching how praise, or rather inflated praise, or the wrong kind of praise, can have an adverse effect on us as we are young and developing. And sorry, Eddie, I have to do a bit of praise of you here in my introduction, but I'm sure you'll take it the right way. So there's no pressure whatsoever. Eddie has written lots and lots of articles, but also a great book, an excellent book called Admire Me. And in this, he describes how the Western individualistic way of living sort of seems to promote self-admiration, which starts at a really early age. Children are admired, put on a pedestal, and they are encouraged to excel. Now, you might think compliments are good for children, that they help their self-esteem. But Eddie's research has found that, that can really backfire, and that children can develop narcissistic traits. And that can really lead to very complex relationships later on in life. Now, Montessorians know, of course, that praise, or rather rewards, do not help self-esteem or growth. It rather puts on pressure. I mean, inner drive, inner motivation is what helps us grow, which is why it's so important to stimulate concentration in our Montessori environments. And that is, of course, what I'm wishing at this instance, a lot of concentration in the audience. And I hope you will really enjoy Eddie's talk, and I hope he will enlighten and delight us, which I'm sure he will do, no question. Eddie, good luck, and we'll look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Yoke, for such a wonderful introduction. And Eddie, now the speaking floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meta and Yoke, for the very kind introduction. It's such a great honor for me to be able to talk to so many Montessori experts, teachers, and educators at the same time. It's a great opportunity, I think, for us to connect and to exchange ideas. So as Meka said at the end of the talk, we will create breakout rooms to discuss some of the things that we will talk about during this presentation. I will now try to share my screen. Just let me know if everything works. Can you all see my slides? Great.
Yes, it works.
Great, thank you. It's such a remarkable time. I can't even describe how I feel at this moment because, of course, the world is in crisis, and I feel like much of the future is being decided as we speak in the election in the United States. But also, I think over the past few months since the Corona crisis happened, we've been struggling with so many questions as teachers and educators about how we can ensure that our children remain motivated and engaged despite all the challenges that they face. How can we raise children's self-esteem? How can we motivate them? How can we help them persist even in the face of adversity, even during such a crisis as the COVID crisis? And during this talk, I want to discuss these questions from an historical perspective, discussing the kinds of ways we've been thinking about these questions in the past, and also discuss some recent research that shows how some of the things that we are intuitively inclined to do sometimes don't work. And I will present some strategies that we could use as teachers, but also as parents, to try to help kids become more motivated and help them feel good about themselves. And I think the common theme of this presentation is the question how we can help children from a young age become resilient learners. When I started studying parenting, I noticed that the way we raise kids has changed quite dramatically over the past few decades. So this is a Google Ngram figure that displays how we've used the word parenting over the past few decades. And what is really surprising to me is that the word parenting didn't even exist in US dictionaries until 1958. It didn't become very common in English literature until the 1970s. So apparently in the 1970s, the way we raise kids has changed dramatically. So something happened in the 1970s. During that time in California, the self-esteem movement emerged. The self-esteem movement was based on the idea that many of the problems that American society faced at the time, anxiety and depression, aggression and violence, but also underperformance in school and teenage pregnancy, could all be traced back to this one very simple underlying cause of low self-esteem. Children feel bad about themselves and therefore they engage in those destructive behaviors. So the most effective way in which a society can prevent all those societal issues is raising children's self-esteem from a very young age. That became the basis of many interventions that were implemented in California at the time, but throughout Western society. One of the assumptions that underlies these self-esteem programs is that what is key to children's self-esteem is praise. If you just tell children over and over again how great they are, they will eventually internalize this feeling and feel good about themselves. And this is a pretty pervasive belief. We surveyed hundreds of Dutch parents a few years ago, and what we found is that a large majority of them even believe that children need praise in order to feel good about themselves, which is quite a dramatic statement. It suggests that without praise, children would never be able to feel good about themselves. So a question that I've asked in my work is, as Joke already said during her introduction, is, did these practices work or did they have an unintended consequence? When we look at children's self-esteem levels since the 1970s, they've remained equal. Children's self-esteem has not increased or decreased since that time on a societal level. However, it does seem to be the case that children's narcissism levels did increase. So since the 1970s, narcissism levels in young adults have increased quite steeply, as you can see in this figure. Which suggests, as a historian from the 1970s already predicted, that we are maybe inadvertently creating a culture of narcissism. After the publication of the study that I just showed, there was even an issue of Time magazine that labeled the current generation the me generation. And of course, as a researcher, but also somebody who cares about the current generation of youngsters, I don't think these labels are very productive. However, I do think that they hint at an underlying idea that some of the things that we believe are raising self-esteem might not actually work and could potentially contribute to narcissism. So one question that I would like to discuss in the first part of my presentation is it possible that parents are well-intentioned but inadvertently raising narcissism instead of self-esteem? So what is narcissism actually? Well, if you look at the ways in which psychologists have described narcissism, they said, well, narcissism is having inflated self-esteem, or exaggerated self-esteem, or excessive self-esteem. unwarranted self-esteem, or overly high self-esteem, or defensive high self-esteem. And what these psychologists suggest is that there's this one spectrum from very low to very high self-esteem, and at the very end, very high self-esteem, they are the narcissists. But that idea turns out to be wrong. There's no association between self-esteem and narcissism. If there is no association between the two, what does it mean? So what is self-esteem? Self-esteem refers to the idea that children with high self-esteem see themselves as worthy, valuable individuals who are neither worse nor better than another person. They don't feel superior to others necessarily, but they just feel confident and satisfied with who they are as an individual. However, narcissism reflects more of this idea of superiority. Children with high narcissism levels, narcissistic children, they tend to see themselves as superior to their peers. They think they're better than others and more entitled than others, without necessarily feeling good about themselves. So it's perfectly possible to have low self-esteem and still think of yourself as superior to others. And at the same time, it's also possible to have high self-esteem, to think of yourself as a worthy person without seeing yourself as superior. In my work, I study narcissism and self-esteem in children age 7 and older, because this is middle to late childhood is a critical transition period in the development of self-esteem and narcissism. At that age, children acquire two critical cognitive abilities. From the age of 7, children can form global evaluations of themselves as an individual. If you interview younger kids, and you probably know as teachers, they typically tend to describe themselves in very concrete, observable ways. Like they define themselves in terms of concrete, observable traits. I can play soccer really well. I can count really fast. I have nice blonde hair. I'm a very kind brother or sister. But they're not yet able to integrate all these different domain-specific self-evaluations and integrate them into one judgment. I like myself, or I'm a great person. Also, from the age of 7, kids become more and more inclined to make social comparisons and to use those social comparisons to define themselves. So of course, younger kids also compare themselves to others, but doesn't affect their self-image much. You can ask a group of 4-year-olds who can draw, who's the best drawer in class, and it's perfectly possible for 25% of the class to raise their hand, and they see no statistical problem with that. They think, of course, everybody can be the best. But from the age of 7, kids use those social comparisons to realistically change their self-image. And also, so from this age, it's possible for kids to have narcissistic self-views such as, I think I'm better than others. I think I'm more deserving than others. When we think of narcissism, we often think of a child shown on the left, somebody who lashes out against other kids, somebody who's aggressive, who feels entitled to privileges. And what we sometimes forget is that the child on the right can also be narcissistic. Narcissism goes hand in hand with feelings of anxiety and depression, because kids with narcissistic traits, they see themselves as this great, invincible, superior individual, but they also expect themselves to live up to that image. They expect themselves to excel all the time. They expect themselves to be the best. And whenever that doesn't happen, whenever they don't succeed, they tend to feel bad about themselves. So it's also important to recognize these feelings in kids who don't necessarily, from the outside, look like somebody who has these inflated self-image. I thought somebody asked a question, but I didn't get the question. Oh, there was nobody asked a question. Okay.
It's okay, Eddie. I think somebody accidentally unmuted themselves,
Okay,
and it's
okay,
fixed now. Thank you. Sorry
okay,
about
thank
that.
you. No, no problem. We conducted a study where we wanted to investigate this fragile nature of this narcissistic self-image. So what we did, we invited children between the age of 8 and 12 to our lab in Amsterdam, where we invited kids to stand on a podium, as you can see on the slides, and we asked them to sing a song of their own choosing. We recorded it using a camera, and we told them, well, we will record your performance and we will show it to a professional singer who's waiting in another room. So we will record it and then show the recording to somebody who will then come in then enter the room and say what she thinks of your performance. So they sang their song, we videotaped it, we brought the recording to another room, and then the professional singer entered the room and told children in one group, you sang incredibly well. Inflated praise. So this is the type of praise that children with narcissistic traits love to get. But also we had a condition in which a group of kids received modest praise. You sang well. And a group of kids that did not receive praise at all. And what we expected is that for narcissistic kids, even praise that is just modest can feel like an insult. And of course, it's very hard for kids to admit to feeling depreciated. So instead of asking them, we measured their blushing response in their face. So blushing is an involuntary reddening of the face. It means that blood flows through your face. And it typically happens in settings where you feel that it might feel positive, but you feel like you might lose other people's approval of you. And this is, as you can see, what's attached to the child's cheekbone is an infrared sensor. It senses how much blood is pumped through the face at that very moment. And what we found is that kids who are narcissistic blushed a lot when they received modest praise, when they felt that the praise was not positive enough, and maybe they felt slightly depreciated by the praise. And they did not blush at all when they received inflated praise, which was of course completely consistent with how they felt about themselves in the first place. So this shows that even very subtle, seemingly positive feedback can make these narcissistic kids feel bad about themselves. And it just shows how fragile a narcissistic self-image is. Much of my work has focused on the question, well, how does narcissism develop? We know that it emerges around the age of 7, but what are the experiences during the day that feed children's narcissism levels? In the 1960s, Theodore Millen wrote an amazing book where he posed this idea that it might be parental overvaluation that cultivates narcissism. Parental overvaluation means parents who think of their own child as more special and more entitled than others and might give their kids lots of praise. And then over time, children internalize the praise to form a narcissistic views of themselves. We wanted to test this idea, the social learning theory, but we had no idea how to assess overvaluation. So what we first did was we wanted to develop something to measure overvaluation and to find out what it actually means for kids to be overvalued. Of course, like many things in psychology, Sigmund Freud was the first to discuss this idea, and he had an interesting observation. He noticed that in some of his patients who were parents, some of them were inclined to ascribe every perfection to the child, and to conceal and to forget all the child's shortcomings. And according to Freud, in these parents' minds, the child shall once more really be the center and core of creation, His Majesty the baby. And he was inspired by a painting that he saw um, in the early 1900s in London when he visited London, which called the Majesty the Baby, His Majesty the Baby. And as you can see, this is a child that's crossing the street dressed as a little princess. And as you can see in the background, all the policemen are stopping traffic to let her through safely. We developed a questionnaire to assess parental overvaluation using statements such as, my child deserves special treatment, or I would find it disappointing if my child was just a regular child, which shows that parents who overvalue don't just believe that their child is special and deserves special treatment, but also that their own feelings of pride are contingent on the child's specialness, which means if the parent notices that the child isn't that special or is not performing that well, he or she might be disappointed or maybe even a little bit ashamed. So it's extremely conditional. As a first step, we measured overvaluation in parents, and then we asked parents, well, how do you see your child compared to other children? And we said, look at this figure. There are 7 images, and in each image, your child, or my child, therefore the M, is displayed in a gray circle, and other kids are displayed in a white circle. And as you can see, the size of the gray circle is gradually increasing with each picture. And what we noticed is that parents who overvalued were more inclined to select figure 6 and figure 7, in which their own child is displayed as bigger and presumably more important than their peers. Also, Freud said, in a way, parental overvaluation is unrealistic in the sense that it is slightly detached from reality. Parents have overly positive, inflated perceptions of their child. Parents who overvalue tend to overestimate, overclaim, and overpraise students' qualities. In one of our studies, we asked parents, well, how smart do you think your child is? And then we measured children's actual IQ scores using a standardized IQ test. And what we found is that parents who overvalue think the child is very smart, but in reality, the child's actual IQ scores don't differ from those of other kids. The parents' perceptions seem to be inflated. In another study, we presented parents with these were American parents. We showed them a long list of 80 different topics that children are typically familiar with at the end of elementary school. These are topics such as the Mississippi, or Neil Armstrong, or Berlin. And the only thing parents had to do was indicate, is your child familiar with this topic, yes or no? But what parents didn't know is that in the same list, we also included topics that don't actually exist. We made up a few book titles, a few celebrities, and what we found is that parents who overvalued claimed that their child was familiar with all those different topics, including the topics that don't actually exist. So parents who overvalue seem to have this tendency to overestimate their child's IQ, but also to overestimate how much their child can actually know. In a final study, we also we went to parents and children's homes. We measured how much parents overvalued, and then we simply observed parent-child interactions, and we counted how often parents praised. And we noticed that parents who scored high on overvaluation praised their kids about 62% more often than the parents who scored low, even when children didn't perform extraordinarily well on the task that they were doing. So even when undeserved. And I think these findings jointly show that parental overvaluation seems to be detached from reality. They seem to be based on parents' overly positive perceptions of their child, but not on the child's actual personality or actual competencies. And parents who overvalue also seem to have a strong tendency to make the child stand out from others. And one way to make the child stand out very effectively is by giving the child a unique, very uncommon first name. There are a few horrible examples, of course, from children who received very weird names such as pilot inspector or moxie crime fighter, but it happens even on a normal distribution. So what we did, we went to regular elementary schools in the Netherlands. We gave kids a questionnaire for their parents. So parents reported how much they overvalued, and we looked at the child's first name and when the child was born, as well as the child's biological sex. And there's this great database in the Netherlands where you can look up how often a child born in a specific year of a specific sex received a certain first name. And then you can calculate a certain popularity index. And we found that parents who overvalued when kids were 8 or 12 years old, between 8 and 12 years old, tended to give their child very unique, uncommon first names, which suggests that because we measured overvaluation at the age of 8, parents already overvalued their kids before they were actually born, because parents typically think of the child's name before the child is actually born. And this showed us that parental overvaluation is this belief that your child is more special than others, more entitled than others, and this tendency to give kids lots of praise, regardless of their actual performance. And knowing this and having this questionnaire allowed us to test the social learning theory of narcissism. Is it true that children develop these narcissistic traits when they are overvalued by their parents? We conducted a study where we measured children's narcissism levels throughout late childhood, middle to late childhood, 4 times. We also measured parents' overvaluation. And what we found is that the more parents overvalued their kids, the more likely children were to develop narcissistic traits. But not vice versa. It's not the case that because children are narcissistic, parents are more likely to overvalue. No, it's because overvaluation that children develop these narcissistic views of themselves. And parental overvaluation did not impact children's self-esteem at all, which shows that being overvalued, being put on a pedestal by your parents, gives you the sense of being special and being entitled, but does not make you feel good about yourself. Does not make you feel like a worthy or valuable individual. Theodore Millen, the same person I just mentioned, wrote an interesting paragraph in the 60s where he described how parental overvaluation could affect children. And this was long before there was any research on this topic. He said, when a child is overvalued, or when children are overvalued, they learn to view themselves as special beings. They learn to expect subservience from others. They begin to recognize that their mere existence is sufficient to provide pleasure to others, and that their every action evokes commendation and praise. At face value, this seems to be true, but I don't agree with the last part of the sentence where he says, when children are overvalued, they believe that their existence is sufficient to provide pleasure to others, because I think parental overvaluation sends the exact opposite message. When your parent thinks of you as a special individual, but who feels disappointed in you when you don't live up to that image, that is extremely conditional, and children are very sensitive to that. Children know when parents' approval is not unconditional, but conditional on them doing extremely well in school, having higher status than their peers, or excelling in some other way. So in a sense, parental overvaluation doesn't give kids the feeling that they are worthy for who they are. It gives them the feeling that they are worthy to the extent that they can live up to their parents' own inflated expectations. I am not sure if you can read the letters on this slide. Maybe Joke recognizes this image. This is a poster that I see in many of the elementary schools in the Netherlands where I do research. And it says 101 ways to praise a child. And it literally lists 101 ways to praise a child. I'm just going to list a few examples. Terrific. You're amazing. You did incredibly well. You are fantastic. Perfect. You're awesome. And what these types of praise have in common, we argue, is that they are inflated, which means it's not just positive, they're extremely positive. Instead of telling children that they did well, parents tell them they did incredibly well. Or instead of telling children that they did a good job, parents tell them, you did a fantastic job. And what we did is we studied this type of praise, inflated praise, in parent-child interactions. So we asked parents to administer mathematics exercises to the child who was between 7 and 11 years old. And while they were doing it, we videotaped it, and afterwards we just counted how often did parents praise and how often did they praise in inflated ways. The first thing we noticed is that 25% of all the praise that children receive is inflated. And we also found that parents were most likely to give inflated praise to children who had low self-esteem. And it seems to make sense, because if parents notice that, or when parents notice that kids don't feel good about themselves, they want to compensate for that. They want to make it right by giving kids lots of inflated praise to try to boost their ego. However, we found that over time, so we measured praise, and then we followed the development of children's self-esteem over 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months. And what we found is that the more inflated praise children received, the lower their self-esteem 6 months later, 12 months later, and 18 months later. And we also found in a subgroup of kids that inflated praise predicted increased narcissism. So how is that possible? And this is an image, I think, that captures what's going on. When the dad praises his son in an inflated way, he paints this unrealistically positive image of the child. And of course, maybe the first few seconds, the child might feel great about himself. He feels grandiose because he notices, well, maybe I am incredible. Maybe I am this amazing individual. But over time, of course, childhood is full of setbacks or struggles and failures. Children know that they will not be able to live up to that grandiose image that the parents have, and therefore feel down about themselves. And this is something that parents might not easily recognize, and maybe this is also something that might happen in a classroom. When you praise a child, almost always the child responds positively in that very moment. But many of the harmful effects of praise occur later, when children face struggles or setbacks or failures, and they realize that they will not be able to live up to the expectations you had of them. And this can create this vicious cycle where you want to raise children's self-esteem, you try to do so by giving lots of praise. Unfortunately, the praise doesn't work. It works even if it even lowers self-esteem. And then when you notice that the child has even lower self-esteem, you feel even more inclined to give inflated praise. This is a Van Gogh painting, and this is part of a study that we conducted where we wanted to investigate how does inflated praise impact children's motivation. What we did, we asked kids that they could make a drawing, that they would copy this Van Gogh drawing, and we told them that we would bring their drawing to a professional painter who was waiting in another room. They copied the drawing. We took their drawing to another room, and the painter wrote a note for the kids. And in one condition, he said, "This is an incredibly beautiful drawing." In another condition, the teacher said, or the painter said, "This is a beautiful drawing, modest praise." And in yet another condition, the painter did not provide any praise. Kids read the praise, and then we told them, well, now you can make other drawings, but you can choose which ones. You can choose easy ones. You won't make any mistakes, but you won't learn much either. Or you can do the challenging ones, the difficult ones. You might make some mistakes, but you will definitely learn a lot too. And what we noticed is that children who had low self-esteem, and those are the types of children who tend to receive lots of inflated praise, um, decided to go for the easy drawings when they received inflated praise. Apparently, they were afraid of not being able to live up to that inflated image the painter had of them and their abilities. And they felt like, if I just do the easy ones, I won't make any mistakes. And nobody will criticize me. This was an interesting quote that I think captures the core of what I just said. I think one of the most threatening aspects of praise is the obligation it puts on us to be praiseworthy people. Because if we really believe it when we are told that we are competent or intelligent or beautiful, then we are always on the spot to be competent or to be intelligent or to be beautiful. In many cases, praise creates this pressure in kids to live up to the image you portrayed of them. So I think if we summarize these findings, they show that we are always well-intentioned. We want to raise children's self-esteem. But sometimes we use the exact practices that don't actually raise self-esteem, but sometimes even lower self-esteem and cultivate narcissism. I think, especially now during the COVID-19 crisis, we have to think about ways in which we can raise self-esteem effectively without cultivating narcissism. How can we raise children's self-esteem? But also, how can we do it in ways that motivates kids to take on challenges and to persist in the face of setbacks? A graduate student of mine, Kelly Zimmer, and me, we wrote a paper where we discussed that self-esteem has two very important pillars. One is acceptance, and the other is competence. To experience high self-esteem, it's critical for children to feel that they are loved and appreciated by other people, but also to feel that they can acquire new skills and that they are effective at achieving their goals. And when they have these two experiences, they tend to have high self-esteem. How can we help children feel more accepted? What our research shows is that perhaps the most important ingredient of a child's self-esteem is how much warmth and affection the child receives from his social environment, especially from significant others, so parents and teachers, but also friends in classrooms. And warmth is very different from lavishing kids with praise, giving them lots of praise. Warmth means you show interest in a child's activities. You share joy with the child, and you make the child feel that you appreciate their presence. And from these experiences, children tend to develop the feeling they are worthy and valuable to them, and they internalize that feeling and develop higher self-esteem. These experiences of warmth and affection turn out to be especially effective when they are provided in unconditional ways. Sometimes, maybe unconsciously, We might make our acceptance of children contingent on them doing well in school, they obey our orders in class, or in other ways they live up to our expectations. But children know when the love they receive from others is conditional. It's important to be unconditional, to respect the child's value, the child's intrinsic value, regardless of whether the child lives up to your expectations. In the 1960s, Carl Rogers described this idea of unconditional regard as an atmosphere which demonstrates I care, not I care for you if you behave thus and so. And I think this also resonates with perspectives of teachers who want to make children feel like they are worthy parts of a community, even if they don't perform well or even if they misbehave. We conducted a study in the first class of secondary school in the Netherlands, where kids are typically very nervous about which grades they will get. We interviewed kids the very day that they received the very first report card of the school year. And we asked them to report how they felt about themselves after reading their grades. And we measured feelings of shame, feeling bad about themselves, feeling hopeless, feeling helpless. And what we found is that kids who got low grades felt ashamed of themselves. They had very strong negative self-feelings. But what we did with kids several weeks before they received these report card grades, we did an intervention. And in one half of the kids, we asked them to reflect on experiences in which they were appreciated by other people as an individual unconditionally. And many kids, for instance, wrote about friendships in which somebody appreciated them even if they did something that disappointed the friend, for instance. And this very simple exercise of just reflecting on this feeling of unconditional regard was sufficient to buffer negative self-feelings several weeks later after receiving low grades in school, which shows that feeling loved by other people unconditionally gives kids this buffer, this idea that I'm a valuable person, regardless of, without having to meet any external conditions. And even if I don't do well in school, doesn't mean I have to be ashamed of myself. And we also found that this feeling of unconditional regard did not affect the actual performance in the next set of exams. So it was not demotivating. It's not that they didn't care about their grades anymore. They just didn't feel bad about themselves anymore. Another key ingredient of self-esteem is competence. And I think this is something that we all know. But there's a strong tendency, I think, especially in Western society, is that in order to make children feel competent, we should give them easy tasks on which they can easily succeed, which resonates, I think, with the participation trophy movement that emerged in the United States, where kids would not receive a trophy for being a winner, but just for participating. I think children have an intrinsic desire to feel challenged. They want to, they have this spontaneous inclination to develop and acquire new skills and to challenge themselves. And Carol Dweck, who was my mentor at Stanford, of course, wrote this amazing book, Mindset, where she says, if I notice that I give a child an exercise that's too easy for him or her, I say, whoa, I apologize for wasting your time. Let's do something that you can actually learn from. Try to make sure that during classroom exercises, children feel challenged, that they feel like they are outside of their comfort zone and they are actually learning new skills and abilities. However, I know it's not always easy to help kids see their own growth and development over time. But especially in childhood, children learn so quickly that it's easy for for them sometimes to forget how much they actually learn. We did a study where we had kids from all ages between 8 and 18 reflect on experiences, reflect on how much they've improved themselves over time in a certain area. And we received stories such as a 13-year-old girl who wrote, well, I got better at horse riding. That's because I trained really hard every Sunday, every Saturday. I researched lots of things about horse riding. I contacted experts for finding out their strategies. And I also asked my mom to film me while I was horse riding to learn in what ways I could do better. And this very simple exercise, just reflecting on how much you've improved over time, was sufficient to make children feel proud of themselves, to notice a sense of progress within themselves, but most importantly, they started to care more about improving themselves than about outperforming their classmates. They became less competitive with their classmates and much more interested in improving their own skill set over time. So I think this links back to the question I started the presentation with: how can we create resilient learners? And what the first part of my presentation shows is that some of the strategies that we might intuitively be inclined to use, especially praise, as many Montessorians know, as Joke also emphasized, doesn't always work. But what does seem to work is knowing that children's self-esteem is based on two important pillars: acceptance and competence. And to make sure that in our interactions with kids throughout the day, as parents, as teachers, we try to make children feel accepted, and we try to challenge them while helping them recognize their own improvement over time. Thank you very much. This was my presentation. We are now moving to the breakout rooms where we want to further discuss this idea of resilient learners. This is a quick instruction. So a breakout room is just a small, maybe Meka can tell you more about this, but this is just a small room where we put 4 individuals in the same room at the same time, where we would like to ask you to, of course, get to know each other, but also to discuss the core question of this presentation. What do you think? What is your perspective on how we can help kids become resilient learners? And what are some of the strategies that you use in a school, at home, as a teacher, or as a parent, that we could utilize? And then after you've discussed this question for 15 minutes, we will, of course, have a plenary discussion to discuss your perspectives and exchange ideas.
Thank you, Eddie. This was an amazing talk, and we have some really great feedback in the chat saying people are being blown away, and this was a fantastic presentation. Thank you, Eddie. We will now go into breakout rooms, as Eddie said. For those of you who did not do this before, please do not worry. It's just a small, as we call it, a technological transition. And what's going to happen is when Sveta, my colleague, hits the button, breakout rooms, your screen is going to turn black. And then in just a few seconds after that, you will only see 3 other people. So there will be 4 frames on your screen. And you will be able to talk to each other in a small forum.